God is letting that friction separate you from the world to be with Him. He is trying to pull you out of slavery to sin into a loving relationship with Himself. The real blessing is that friction, is that separation. It's holiness.
Welcome to the Reach College Podcast with your speaker, Pastor Taylor Gabbert.
So you may know, or it just may be easy to guess, that I'm kind of a history of warfare nerd. Like, that's something I definitely like to read books about. And there's a really old, boring classic on warfare called On War. Very original title. It's by a guy named Karl von Clausewitz, and it was written in 1832. So it's endured because it has some of the most basic principles of warfare in it. And one of my favorite parts of that book, he has something called the concept of friction. So the concept of friction is essentially that there's all of these little things that kind of wear down an army. And most battles are won and lost before the battle even starts because of this slow, degrading effort of friction. He said that friction was really the term that encompassed everything that was the difference between war on paper and war in real life, right? Because you could plan a battle and you could plan all these campaigns and plan all this stuff. But as soon as all that stuff started moving, friction set in, right? And it could be something simple, right? You could think of it like a wagon wheel that's a little bit too old, and as it goes over more and more rocks and pebbles, eventually it breaks. And maybe that wagon had the ammunition that you needed for that battle, and in that moment, the guys run out of ammo and then they lose, right? And so it's all of those small instances that go into the things being even present for the fight, or the things going well when the fight starts, right? Friction can be even things like the weather, right? There's this the most famous battle of the Napoleonic era, right around the time this book was written, is the Battle of Waterloo, and they spent a lot of that day waiting for the ground to be dry so that they could move across it easier. It's that kind of thing, right? And so when I look at the concept of friction, one of the things that I see is it's how God intervenes in warfare, right? It's like God's participation in it, because now there are moments in history that we see these kind of like divine intervention moments where something really crazy and abrupt happens, and the only way to explain it is that God got involved. But a lot of times, what's the difference between that wagon wheel breaking and not breaking? Just God letting it roll over one too many rocks. It's the all-encompassing detail that God orchestrates in the whole world to make His events happen. Well, that same thing happens in your life. There is friction in our lives, in our day in and day out, and really that friction, it's the difference between everything we plan on doing and what actually happens. Friction could be as simple as catching one too many red lights the day you get fired, right? It could be so many different things going wrong. It could be slipping in the shower. Who knows? It's just all the little stuff that goes into life and gets you to go or do what God actually has for you. And you can want and you can desire and plan, but at the end of the day, all that friction comes into play, and it both guides and it sanctifies you. Think about what friction does. It smooths things out. When you sand something down, you're literally applying a lot of friction, and you are making that thing refined. Well, have you ever run really rough sandpaper across your skin? It hurts. That's what sanctification does. No one should do that. Please don't go home and do that. Some of you, I see at least Caleb is wearing the shirt where it says sanctification hurts so good. Because that friction, it is painful to go through, and yet the refining that it does in our life, it smooths us. It makes us more Christ-like. And we know that that's a good thing. So we're in a series called The March of Redemption. And we're looking at how God moved the gospel one generation at a time, all the way really to Jesus and then all the way to you, right? And so right now we're in Jacob's life. And if you've been here for the portion that's on Jacob, what you've noticed is that Jacob is trying to be in charge. He's got plans, he's got schemes, he's got answers, he'll lie to get his way. He's always kind of controlling. He learned it from his mother, and he is basically always trying to get the angle, get the advantage, get the inside track, and he's always trying to accomplish what he has in mind. And yet, one chapter at a time, we see the friction in Jacob's life wearing him down. It's starting to grind away at his plans and his will. He's more and more having to acknowledge that God is really the one in charge and not him, that he's not capable of taking God's spot. And so God is wearing him down, but God is also separating him because God wants Jacob for himself. So even though friction is this painful experience, this refining experience that makes us uncomfortable, it takes away from us things that we want, things we plan for, yet it makes us separate from the world and in God's arms and in God's will, which is ultimately the best place to be. That's what God is trying to do. So today, we're going to see God let the friction in Jacob's life begin to really overwhelm him and shift Jacob's priorities to do what God wants. So God is going to use seemingly good blessings from the world, but he's going to use them for his purposes to get Jacob where he wants him to go. I want you to see that blessings from the world, when God undermines them, he uses them for his purpose, but blessings from the world are no blessings at all. They end up just being hooks. They're the things that keep us attached to the world when God is trying to separate us from the world. So look with me at Genesis chapter 30, starting in verse 25. Now, it came about when Rachel had given birth to Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away so that I may go to my own place and to my own country. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go. For you yourself know my service, which I have rendered you." But Laban said to him, "If it pleases you at all, stay with me. I have determined by divination that the Lord has blessed me on your account." He continued, "Name me your wages, and I will give them." But Jacob said to him, "You yourself know that I have served you, and how your livestock have fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased to a multitude, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also?" So he said, "What shall I give you?" And Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this one thing for me, I will again pasture and keep your flock. Let me pass through your entire flock today, removing from there every speckled or spotted sheep, and every black sheep among the lambs, and the spotted or speckled among the goats, and those shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later, when you have come concerning my wages. Everyone that is not speckled or spotted among the goats, or blacks among the lambs, if found with me, will be considered stolen." Laban said, "Good, let it be according to your word." Okay. So the first thing that happens is Joseph has just been born, and this begins to prompt Jacob to think again about what the purpose of his life is, right? Now, why, Joseph's like the last born of the whole litany of sons that Jacob has had up to this point. And so the key, though, is that he's the firstborn son of the wife Jacob loves the most. And so what's happening is that Jacob has treasured in his heart Joseph, and it begins to jog him back to his priorities, right? This happens in life, in our culture. Like, we have people who, they stop going to church for like a decade or whatever. They, in their college years, they quit, and eventually they have a kid, and what happens? They're like, we should really go to church, right? And it's because all of a sudden, when you have that kid, it brings the world into perspective of being bigger than just about yourself. Now, a great goal in your life would be to have that perspective without having to have a kid to do it, okay? But in this moment, he's had Joseph, and his perspective is starting to take shape. And he says, "I want to go back to the land of my fathers." But Laban doesn't want that. Now, I want you to see, Laban's not the good guy. Part of the indication, he says, "Well, I've determined by divination that God blesses me through you, right? Now, what's he saying? First of all, that term divination, that's a key word, a context word for the current audience, because they already have the written law and they know that divination is evil. It's a sinful thing. It's against the Lord. So in this moment, that's like their code word for Laban's not worshiping God. He's not saying, hey, no, stay with me. I want to be close to God. He's saying, no, hey, stay close because somehow you following God benefits me in material ways, right? He's being greedy. He wants gain from God without actually honoring God. So he says, name your wages. Now, here's the key. This name your wages, it was weird when I was first reading this because it sounds like Jacob says, no, don't give me anything. You're not going to give me anything. And then the next second he says, except for all the sheep that are this color. And it seems like a contradiction, except that's not the conversation. When he says, don't give me anything, is he saying, I won't take anything from you on debt, but instead moving forward, I'm going to take a certain wage from you, like naturally. Okay, so think about it like this. When he was setting up to get Rachel, he got Rachel as his wife and owed Laban 7 years. So he's in debt for getting his wife, and that's how he's paying that debt off. He serves Laban that duration of time because he got something. And that's what Laban is offering him again. He's saying, hey, we can keep the system going, man. What do you want next? What do you want next? I'll give it to you, and then you can serve me. And Jacob says, no, we're not going to do it like that. And he says, what we're going to do is I'm willing to keep working for you just like normal. But from now on, all the sheep and all the goats, all the lambs and the goats that are a certain color, I get. They're just mine, right? And he even offers to start at 0. He says, I'll go through the flocks today and I'll pull all the sheep that are like that out. And since they're your sheep and you can take them and they'll be yours still, but any more sheep, any more goats that come out of that color, I get. Now, if you know anything about how genetics work, that's already not a great plan, right? If he's like, I only have white sheep and all the ones that come out black, I'm going to keep, right? It's not like super forward thinking, right? But in this moment, he's offering up this plan, and essentially Jacob, he sees this as kind of his get-rich-quick scheme. Okay, he thinks that he can manipulate this situation, that he can make it happen and get one over on Laban again. And what is he doing? He's once again controlling the situation. He's once again taking matters into his own hands, and he's saying, okay, I can work this out, but I won't actually owe him, and it'll just be a product of the process. I'll have what I want without owing Laban anything, right? And so he's beginning to let the hooks be put back in him. So he makes this proposition to only take the sheep that are given to him going forward, and Laban agrees. Look at verse 35. So he removed on that day the striped or spotted male goats and all the speckled or spotted female goats, every one with white on it, and all the black ones among the sheep. And he put them in the care of his sons. And he put a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Okay, so first of all, I want to point out that the sheep that he's offering to keep are also just inherently the more uncommon colorations, right? So he's already saying, I will take the minority of the flock, and it's going to be the minority of the flock born out of the majority of the flock. Because then what happens is, even though he was the one that offered to go through and clear out the sheep, Laban and him, they're like the same person basically, except one is God's and one isn't. Because Laban is like, no, you sit tight, I'll get all the sheep out that are the ones that you're going to own in the future, right? So Laban goes through the flock and he pulls out all the minority colored sheep and he gives them to his sons, and then they travel away, right? And so now here is Jacob sitting there with a whole flock that he doesn't own, hoping that they produce sheep that he will own, but he's got this unsupervised distance put between him and Laban. Now I want you to see that there is a theme running through this entire chapter, or this entire portion of story, that is about separation. This is the first moment that separation happens. There's breathing room here, right? Laban separates, and this is going to give Jacob a chance to be with God and to start to adjust his perspective even more, because he doesn't have Laban looking over his shoulder, watching what he's doing, breathing down his neck, okay? So, in this moment, they've separated the flocks, and Jacob is choosing his own path instead of going back to the land that God has given him. He is inherently not trusting in God. Now, God has this thing where he blesses his children even when they're being dumb. But I've told you guys this before. What's really the difference between God's blessing when you're obeying him and the difference and God's blessing when you're not obeying him? It's still a blessing for God to discipline you. But when you're not obeying, it just feels way more uncomfortable. And so even though God is going to bless Jacob, and we're going to see the blessings of God unfold in Jacob's life, Jacob is going to inherently have a lot of discomfort that's created even because of these blessings. He's going to miss out on really enjoying what God is doing. Look at verse 37. Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar, almond, and plane trees and peeled white stripes in them, exposing the white that was in the rods. He set the rods which he had peeled in front of the flocks in the drinking troughs, that is, in the watering channels where the flocks came to drink, and they mated when they came to drink. So the flocks mated by the rods, and the flocks delivered striped, speckled, and spotted offspring. Then Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face toward the striped, and all the black of the flock of Laban. And he put his own herds apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Moreover, whenever the stronger of the flock were mating, Jacob would place the rods in the side of the flock in the drinking troughs, so that they would mate by the rods. But when the flock was sickly, he would not put them in. So the sickly were Laban's, and the stronger were Jacob's. So the man became exceedingly prosperous, and had large flocks, and female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. Okay. First of all, this is super confusing if you're not like a shepherd in your daily life, right? Like what's actually happening here. So I did some research, and apparently this is super confusing if you are a shepherd. It doesn't really matter. This apparently just makes no sense, right? And so there's this weird set of really like superstitions happening here, and even contradictions, right? There's a level at which some of the input in this text is actively conflicting, and so people have had a hard time over the centuries of studying the Bible, the millennium of studying the Bible, trying to really understand what's happening here. I actually read a liberal theologian this week who said this makes perfect sense if you remove about 3 verses, and I was like, well, that's a problem. So here's what we know is happening. We know that he first starts breeding by color, and so a certain minority is born out of this flock that's pretty much just one color, right? And so that's already miraculous. And so this minority flock begins to be bred, and then we know that he breeds by size, and that's actually a little bit easier, right? Because he can kind of do some animal husbandry, and he can isolate the bigger sheep together so they breed with each other. And by and large, what's happening again is a separation is occurring. There is a separation of Lot's flock, which becomes smaller and smaller and weaker, and Jacob's flock, which becomes bigger and bigger and stronger. And so this separation is being lived out even in the blessing that God is leveraging on Jacob and on Laban. Now, the most important thing is the very last verse in that portion of verse 43, because that verse right there is meant to indicate that Jacob is once again following in Abraham and Isaac's footsteps. He is once again God's chosen child that is moving the ball of redemption forward another generation, and he's prospering. God is giving him blessings, and he is growing rich, and everything is working out for him just like his forefathers. God is making it clear who belongs to him. Now, we're not going to get into this portion today, but in chapter 31, verse 38, we see that at the end of this time, as they have a conversation later, Jacob says, I've been working for you for 20 years. Now, we know he worked for 14 between the 2 wives, So what does that mean? It means that this portion of Scripture that we're reading with the flocks, this is 6 years. 6 years from the time that he said, I really should start thinking about going home, to when he actually is going to pick up and leave is a 6-year gap. Here's the deal. God is going to use you. He's going to put you where he wants to have you. He's going to move you in your life. But there's almost no need for this 6-year-long discomfort that Jacob's going to find himself in, and where he ends up fleeing this situation. If he instead, do you think God couldn't have given him prosperity and blessing if he had just gone home? Just gone back to the land of Canaan, where he was from? Now, God chooses to use the circumstances that Jacob has put himself in to prosper him here, except that he is basically essentially just taking this 6-year pause on being exactly where God wants him to be, which is back home. We're going to see how explicitly God wants him to be there here in a second. So even as God blesses Jacob, what Jacob is going to find himself is actually in increasing trouble with Laban. The real blessing that we're going to see in this passage is the blessing of separation. So if you've ever seen, I'll be honest with you, I've never actually watched the Leonardo DiCaprio Titanic movie, but I did see the old one. And one thing that I asked my parents when I was watching that movie is the people get in the lifeboats and they start, rowing away from the ship as it's sinking. And it seems like, I don't really why. As a kid, I was like, I don't understand why they have to row away so fast. Well, the thing is, a ship that large, as it sinks, water will be sucked in behind it. And if you're a boat sitting right there with that water, you're just going to follow it in, right? And so you can't just get in the lifeboat, which is already a blessing, but you have to get as far away from the thing that's sinking as possible. Here's the thing. The world is passing away, and it will try to take you with it if you don't get away from it. And so what God is trying to do is he's trying to separate you. That's what the word holiness means. When we think of the word holiness, we almost have this that person's so self-righteous. They're they're all pious and ooh, look at them, they're holy. Holiness just means separation. Holiness is just God moving you further and further away from the world. You look more and more different. You are more and more holy. That's all that separation is. And so God in this moment is going to use friction to separate Jacob from the world. Look at chapter 31, starting in verse 1. Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what belonged to our father he has made all his wealth. And Jacob saw the attitude of Laban, and behold, it was not friendly towards him. As it had been before. The Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. Okay. So in this moment, what's the friction being created here? As Jacob gets blessings, the sons of Laban are seeing those blessings and are more and more frustrated with him, more and more jealous of him. See, the world hates when God loves on us, right? And the reason is because most of the world is pining after their perfect life and all the while feeling unhappy. And when you have, less or more than them, but you're happy not because you have a bunch of things, but because God is with you, it burns the world. And so they are getting more and more upset with Jacob, and they start to just accuse. Well, he's stealing from our dad, and he's taking what's our dad's, and they're getting more frustrated with him. And God waits until this moment to be explicit with Jacob. Because in this moment, as the pressure mounts, as the friction becomes to an audible level, that's when God steps in and says, Jacob, I want you to go home. I don't want you to be here. I want you to pick up and leave and know that I will be with you. I'm going to go with you. This is the same thing that Abraham heard when God sent him out all those decades ago, and he said, I'll be with you, and I have a land that I'm going to take you to. And now he's going to take Jacob back to that land. Now, I'll tell you this. A lot of times in our lives, we say, I can't hear God. It's like he's not talking. I'll tell you this. In my life, I really believe that anytime I have not been able to hear God, it's not because God is not talking. It's because I am not listening. And oftentimes when God speaks softly, it's because he wants you to lean in closer so that he can speak to you, so that he can get your attention. That is what's happening with Jacob. Look at verse 4. So Jacob sent word and called Rachel and Leah to his flock in the field. And he said to them, I see your father's attitude that is not friendly toward me as it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength. Your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. However, God did not allow him to do me harm. If he said this, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flock delivered speckled. And if he said this, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock delivered striped. Okay, so the first thing I want you to see is this is part of the explanation for the confusion in the breeding process. The confusion that we saw at the beginning is actually supposed to indicate that Laban is coming back throughout this 6-year period, and he's seeing how Jacob's flock is getting bigger, and he's going, there's a new deal. Now you're only going to get this type of sheep. And yet every time, that became the sheep that were being born. And so if you were in the current audience, you're listening to the breeding section of this story, and you're going, none of this makes any sense. And then you get to this portion, and you go, oh, it didn't make sense because it was miraculous. It was that every time Laban stepped in and cheated him, God said, okay, fine. Only the striped sheep are his wages now. Striped sheep are his wages now. Here's more striped sheep. Every single time. And so Jacob saw that clearly. He saw that with his own eyes, and he kept going, okay, God is stepping in, intervening, and providing for me. Look at verse 9. So God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me. And it came about at the time when the flock was breeding that I raised my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the male goats were were striped, speckled, or molted. Mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in a dream, Jacob. And I said, here I am. He said, now raise your eyes and see that all the male goats that are mating are striped, speckled, or mottled. For I have seen everything that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a memorial stone, where you made a vow to me. Now arise, leave this land, and return to the land of your birth. Okay, so we get another piece of the confusion about the breeding plan here. Okay, what we see when we look at this breeding plan, now I'll be honest with you, when you first read it and you don't know anything about shepherding, you're like, okay, Jacob knows something about putting out striped rods that helps sheep breed different, right? And then I look into it and it's like, no, that's all superstition. That's all just him just kind of hoping something works, right? Trying to be productive. Well, actually, what we see here is that God had shown Jacob that he was going to move, and he was going to move through essentially this supernatural method. Now, what's the purpose of that? It's so that Jacob could see that God was the one doing it, that God was the one intervening in this moment. And Jacob, who has spent his entire life trying to control the circumstances, trying to manipulate things to happen in his way, he was forced in this moment to admit, this is all God. I'm out here putting rods in water troughs, and somehow the sheep are coming out exactly the way that I get to profit from them. The only God is the one supplying this. And I know because he told me before it even started. He told me in a vision. So Jacob is seeing the truth here. God is responsible, and now that he's seen that God is the one blessing him, he sees that God is also the one telling him to go home, and has been for some time. And if God's going to keep blessing him, he knows he needs to obey. He needs to actually follow. And here's the coolest part of this. God doesn't just say, I'll go with you. God doesn't just say, hey, I'm the one doing all this. He reminds Jacob of who he is. He says, Jacob, do you remember when you were at Bethel and I met you there and you worshiped me and you made a vow to me and you became mine? I'm still here. I'm still your God. I'm the same God I was then, and you're still mine. It is not bad. It is actually a really good thing for you in your quiet time, in your time of prayer, to say, God, who am I to you? Am I yours? Am I your child? I ask God on a regular basis to show me who I am to Him and how He sees me. I ask God to show me the gospel, to show me He loves me. And God reveals to me that I am His child. And that is the most comforting thing that I could ever hear from God. It doesn't matter what's going on around me. If I know that my God sees me as His own, that He takes ownership of me. And in this moment, that is the comfort that Jacob is receiving. Now, he needs to get his wives on board because this is his father-in-law that he's about to try to abandon. And that's not going to go well if they're not involved in the plan, if they don't want to do that. So look at verse 14. Rachel and Leah said to him, "Do we still have any share or inheritance in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us and has also entirely consumed our purchase price. Surely all the wealth which God has taken away from our father belongs to us and our children. Now then, do whatever God has told you." I want you to see this. God has even allowed there to be friction and separation between Laban and his daughters, right? His daughters, in this moment, if this is really the people that you should see yourself in this moment. Because in this moment, you have Jacob, who really represents Israel. He represents God's people. And in a way, for us, he represents the church. And then you have the world, and God is separating those two things. And in the middle of that separation, there's a moment of choice for Rachel and Leah. They can either go with God's people, with the church, or they can stay with the world. They have a choice. And what do they recognize? The world doesn't care about them. Laban has taken their dowry and spent it, flittered it away. And see, now what they're seeing is we can't even inherit any kind of wealth. There's no point in even staying here. And as a matter of fact, all of the wealth that we have, all the wealth that our kids are going to have, is because God took it from Laban and gave it to Jacob. That's the truth of the gospel, is God is in the business of taking everything the world has. They're going to have nothing at the end, and He is giving it to the church. And the church is going to have everything because they are His. They're going to inherit the world. And so in this moment, Rachel and Leah, they're the two that are standing between the options and going, why would we go with the world? It doesn't even care for us. It doesn't love us. It's actually just taking from us. Instead, God is taking from the world and giving to His children, and we want to be in that camp. And so they say to Jacob, do whatever you have to do. Now I want you to see Jacob is the representative of Israel. That is really the type he plays in these passages. He is showing us what Israel will someday be. This is meant to almost stab at the people of Israel as they read these stories, because what they're seeing is God's taking care of you even though you're big dumb idiots. And so they are being prepared and told that God is owning you as His children regardless of your behaviors. Now look at verse 17. Then Jacob stood up and put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove away all his livestock and all his property which he had acquired, the livestock he possessed, which he had acquired in Padan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. The final separation. See, again, think of the current audience. What is the current audience doing? The current audience went to Egypt. They flourished there in such a way that they would never have left, except what happened? Friction. They were enslaved because that friction that created, it grew them up in a way that they then left. They were separated from Egypt. And they were separated from Egypt and began to follow God in the wilderness. And in this moment, Lot, who has been in essentially a servant or a slave-like relationship in a way where he has had these debts to Laban, he's worked for him for 20 years, all of a sudden is leaving. He's separating and he's plundering Laban in a way, right? He's, over the course of this time, he's assumed all of these animals and all these things from Laban, all this livestock. He's leaving with all this treasure, which is exactly what the people of Israel do to Egypt. They left, and on their way out the door, the Egyptians were so happy to see him go after the plagues, they were basically giving away their treasure to them. And so in this moment, Israel is able to see how their forefather lived out exactly what they're going through. Israel would never have left Egypt if they hadn't had slavery. Jacob would never have left Laban if there hadn't been so much friction, so much conflict. I want you to see something. There is this claim in philosophy that the biggest problem for the existence of God is the problem of evil. Well, if there's a good God, then how do so many bad things happen? How do bad things happen to innocent people, kids even? Okay, that is tragic. And I've always said two things about the problem of evil. First of all, it's our problem. We're the ones who caused it. God did not cause the evil in the world. We caused it. Now, you may not be responsible specifically for every part of evil in the world, but human beings are. And on top of that, imagine how cruel God would have to be to remove all of the evil in this world, to just make it as comfortable as possible so that you could die someday and go to hell and go, I didn't even know something was wrong. Instead, God has left brokenness in the world so you can look at it with your own two eyes and say, that's not right. Something needs to fix it. And then when you see the gospel, it's as though you see that God is fixing it. And so in this moment, I want you to see that this conflict, this separation, this friction that pervades our lives at every corner, all the stuff that just seems to get in the way constantly, from you getting hit by too many red lights all the way to the worst atrocities of human history, God is letting that friction separate you from the world to be with Him. He is trying to pull you out of slavery to sin into a loving relationship with Himself. The real blessing is that friction. It's that separation. It's holiness. Separate yourself from this world. Listen, I'll tell you this. If there's no friction in your life, things are just cruising, everything's going well, you should ask yourself some hard questions. Because the reality is, if there's no friction in your life, you're not serving the living God, because if you're serving the living God, there's a real enemy who wants to take you out. That He's the producer of that friction, and God lets that happen to drive you further into Himself. And if the enemy's not attacking you, why? It's because the enemy doesn't think you're a threat. Nothing about your life points to Jesus. He's content with that. The question is, if you're following the Lord, why wouldn't this world provide friction? Why wouldn't there be attacks? Why wouldn't there be heaviness in your life? When you point to the living God, the world hates you. Jacob, without even trying to, actually in some cases actively trying not to, his life is pointing to the God he serves. And because of that, there was friction, and God let that friction produce separation and holiness. And now, finally, Jacob's on his way back home, on his way to the promised land. He's been gone for 20 years. 20-year detour. And God has used it and blessed him and built him up. He's produced the patriarchs that are going to be the names, the tribes are given. The nation of Israel sees themselves in Jacob and his sons. And he's finally headed to the land that God has for him. In your life, are you in the middle of a detour? Are you in the middle of a long waiting period where God is just leveraging friction to try to separate you? Or are you finally headed where God has you going?
Hey guys, this is Philip Jackson, pastor of Young Adults at Evergreen Baptist Church. I want to invite you to come to Reach. We meet every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at Evergreen Church in South Tulsa, just east of Mingo on 111th Street. The mission of Reach Tulsa is to cultivate a young adult community that's defined by real transformation and the sincere pursuit of a godly life through training in biblical disciplines, personal development, and intentionally transitioning into independence as mature members of the body of Christ. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and subscribe to our content. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Reach Young Adult Ministry is a part of Evergreen Baptist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For more information and additional lessons, please visit our website, evergreenbc.org.